He was just standing in his driveway changing his Wi-Fi password until flashing lights, suspicion, and a neighbor's 911 call turned a peaceful afternoon into a full-blown police investigation. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in Maple Ridge, Missouri, when Marcus Allen, a tech-savvy man in his 30s, decided to reset his Wi-Fi password. Lately, his internet had been slow, and after noticing an unfamiliar device labeled MapleNet.01 connected to his network, he took action. Stepping outside for a better signal, Marcus stood near his house, eyes on his phone. From her window across the street, Carol Peterson, a longtime resident and self-proclaimed neighborhood watch, saw Marcus and immediately grew suspicious. To her, he looked too focused, too secretive. Carol didn't know Marcus well. He mostly kept to himself, and that unfamiliarity fed her unease. Without speaking to him, she picked up the phone and called 911, reporting suspicious activity. When Officers Detective Harris and Officer Linda Shaw arrived minutes later, they approached Marcus, cautiously asking what he was doing. Calm but confused, Marcus explained he was just updating his router to remove unknown connections. But what they found on his device sent chills down everyone's spine. Someone had hacked into his home security cameras, and not just his. Other homes on the street had also been compromised. As the truth unraveled, it wasn't Marcus who posed a threat, but someone much closer to Carol than she ever imagined. And for the first time, she realized how dangerous assumptions could truly be. Carol Peterson never imagined that one act of vigilance on her part could lead to the uncovering of a crime silently unfolding within her very own home. A retired widow, she often spent her free time gazing out the kitchen window, where she first noticed Marcus Allen standing quietly with a phone in his hand. She didn't know much about Marcus, a private man who never joined neighborhood parties, and it was precisely this distance that allowed her imagination to fill in the blanks with suspicion. Within minutes, she had dialed 911, reporting that Marcus was acting suspiciously. When the police arrived and asked Marcus what he was doing, he calmly explained that he was changing his Wi-Fi password because he suspected someone was freeloading on his network. Under the cautious gaze of the officers, Marcus opened his phone and showed them the list of connected devices, and that's when everything changed. A strange device named MapleNet.01, which didn't belong to him, was actively connected to his network. Upon closer inspection, they discovered that this device was accessing the security cameras inside Marcus' home. But what was even more terrifying, it wasn't just his cameras. The compromised IP addresses revealed that security cameras in several other houses were also being watched. The most chilling part, the access signal wasn't coming from some remote location. It came from a few houses down the street. Marcus, who had some knowledge of cybersecurity, assisted the police in tracing the signal to a specific address. When he read the name of the house aloud, Carol froze. It was her house. The person behind this mass surveillance operation was none other than her own grandson, Brandona, 22-year-old college student she had taken in to help support. When confronted, Brandon initially denied everything, but after being asked to hand over his laptop, he admitted to it all. It had started as a joke, he said, but gradually turned into a twisted curiosity. He had set up a fake Wi-Fi network to trick neighbors into connecting, which then allowed him to infiltrate their cameras. Carol was stunned. She had called the police on an innocent man while the real danger had been living under her roof all along. When Marcus, who had been wrongfully accused, looked her in the eyes and said, "I was just out in the yard fixing my Wi-Fi, and I ended up being treated like a suspect," Carol was speechless. She had let prejudice cloud her judgment, and the price she paid was deep shame and a loss of trust in her community. As Brandon was handcuffed and taken away, Marcus said only one thing. "I don't need an apology. I just need people to do better." And that is what Carol would carry with her for the rest of her life, a lesson about trust bias and the consequences of judgment without understanding the truth. Detective Harris had seen a lot in his years on the force, but even he hadn't expected the trail to lead here to a modest home on the quiet corner of Maple Ridge Lane. Inside, Melanie Peterson, a retired school teacher, stood trembling in her hallway. A few hours earlier, she had been so certain of her instincts. She had called 911 to report Marcus Allen, her quiet, tech-savvy neighbor, for what she claimed was suspicious activity. Now her world was spinning. What no one had expected was that Marcus wasn't the problem. He was the one who uncovered it. Moments before, he had discovered a mysterious device labeled MapleNet01 connected to his home Wi-Fi. After resetting his router and calling in the officers to show the activity logs, a far darker picture emerged. Someone had been remotely accessing his home security cameras, and not just his. Multiple addresses appeared in the access logs. And all the data. It was being funneled to a location just a few doors away. It didn't take long for Marcus and the officers to trace the IP address. The signal was coming from inside Melanie's own home. Her heart sank when the name popped up: Brandon Foster, her 22-year-old nephew, who had been living with her for the past few months. Quiet, always glued to his laptop, Brandon had never seemed threatening, just withdrawn. As Detective Harris and Officer Shaw followed Melanie to her house, she could barely breathe. She knocked on Brandon's door and called out to him. No answer. The officer stepped in, knocking harder. "Brandon, this is the police. Open the door." After a pause, the door creaked open. Brandon stood there pale and fidgeting. "What's going on?" he asked, eyes darting between them. "We have reason to believe you've been illegally accessing private security cameras across the neighborhood," Harris said firmly. "We'd like to see your laptop." Brandon's face twitched. "You can't just take it. You don't have a warrant." "Well, get one," Officer Shaw replied. "But this is your chance to cooperate." After a long silence, Brandon sighed and stepped aside. "It was just a joke at first," he muttered. "I wanted to see if I could hack into someone's Wi-Fi. I didn't think it would go this far. And yet Harris said you ended up watching people in their homes." Melanie's face went pale as the weight of the truth settled on her. She had raised Brandon after his parents split. She paid his tuition. She trusted him. And while she had been busy pointing fingers at an innocent man, the real danger had been under her own roof. Brandon didn't resist arrest. As Officer Shaw placed handcuffs on him, he mumbled, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." But harm had already been done. Outside, Marcus stood near his driveway, arms folded, watching the scene unfold. Harris nodded to him. "You were right. If you hadn't spotted this, who knows how long it would have gone on." Marcus said nothing at first. Then calmly he replied, "I was minding my own business, changing my Wi-Fi password. And I got the cops called on me." Melanie stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I made an assumption and I was wrong." Marcus didn't look angry, just tired. "I don't need an apology," he said quietly. "Just do better." As the patrol car drove away, taking Brandon with it, Melanie stood in the street alone, ashamed and heartbroken. She had trusted the wrong person and misjudged the right one. And that mistake, it would haunt her for a long, long time. The neighborhood of Maple Ridge had always felt safe. It was the kind of place where people waved from their porches, where dogs barked at passing joggers, and children rode their bikes without fear. But all of that changed in a single afternoon, when one man's quiet act of curiosity exposed a hidden danger no one had seen coming. After Brandon Foster was arrested for illegally accessing the Wi-Fi networks and home security cameras of his neighbors, the entire block was left reeling. The same young man whom many had seen mowing the lawn for his Aunt Melanie had secretly been invading their lives. And worst, done it from inside their own community. Melanie could hardly leave her house without feeling the weight of the neighborhood's eyes. Shame hung over her like a storm cloud. She had made a terrible mistake. She had called the police on Marcus Allen, her quiet neighbor, accusing him of suspicious behavior simply because he was standing in his driveway with his phone. She hadn't asked questions. She hadn't tried to understand. She'd just assumed the worst. Now she couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in her mind, Marcus standing calmly as sirens pulled up, confused yet cooperative, and then her world crashing down when the officers discovered her own nephew was behind it all. I never thought, she whispered to herself, staring at the empty chair Brandon used to sit in at the kitchen table. She had welcomed him in, trusted him, defended him. And all the while he had been watching others' neighbors, families, even children through their cameras. Not to steal, not even to blackmail, but simply because he could. For Marcus, the damage was different, but no less painful. He'd always been the quiet type, more comfortable with code than conversation. After moving to Maple Ridge 2 years earlier, he kept to himself, never wanting trouble. He'd dealt with assumptions before, but this time it had almost escalated into something dangerous. "If I hadn't known how to speak to the officers," he said later to a friend, "it could have gone a whole different way." Marcus didn't press charges against Melanie. He didn't ask for an apology. But his trust in the neighborhood had cracked, maybe permanently. When the media picked up the story, "Woman calls cops on black man only to learn her nephew was the real threat," the declined interviews. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Meanwhile, neighbors began to talk more openly, sharing fears, frustrations, and guilt. Many admitted they too had jumped to conclusions about Marcus, never giving him the benefit of the doubt. Some organized a community meeting at the local church. Others reached out to cybersecurity experts to protect their homes from similar breaches. It wasn't just about one young man hacking into Wi-Fi networks. It was about how quickly people judged each other, how fear and bias could cloud even the most seemingly innocent intentions. The attack hadn't come from a stranger in a van. It had come from a kid living down the street. Someone who waved, smiled, and asked to borrow chargers. That made it all the more terrifying. In the weeks that followed, Melanie tried to rebuild her sense of purpose. She visited Marcus' home with a handwritten letter, but he never answered the door. Instead, she left it on the porch, unsure if he would even read it. Inside, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the familiar list of connected devices, this time all verified, secure, and private. He'd changed every password, upgraded his network, and added a firewall. But he couldn't help feeling like something intangible had been broken. Trust. And trust once lost doesn't reboot with a simple password change. Still, there was hope in the air, faint but real. Because the neighborhood had learned something hard, something necessary. They had been reminded that safety isn't just about locked doors or cameras. It's about community, awareness, and the courage to face your own assumptions before they turn into accusations. Maple Ridge would never be the same. But maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. Melanie Foster stood alone on her front porch, arms wrapped tightly around her chest. The sun was beginning to set over Maple Ridge, casting long shadows across the quiet street. But for Melanie, everything felt colder than it should have. A place that once felt familiar now felt foreign, tainted by one decision she could never take back. She had always thought of herself as a good neighbor, a vigilant one, the kind of person who paid attention when something didn't look right. That's why when she saw Marcus Allen standing outside his home with his phone, she had convinced herself something was off. He wasn't hurting anyone. He wasn't even making noise. But in her gut, shaped by years of quiet bias and unspoken fears, she assumed the worst. And so she called the police. It wasn't until the officers arrived and Marcus calmly explained that he was changing his Wi-Fi password that things started to unravel. What was supposed to be a quick check-in became something far more serious when they discovered an unknown device was connected to Marcus's home network. One that was secretly watching through his security cameras. But it didn't stop there. The data trail led right back to Melanie's own home, specifically to her 22-year-old nephew, Brandon, who had been living with her for the past few months. A college student with a gift for technology, and too much time on his hands, Brandon had created a fake Wi-Fi network and hacked into multiple homes on the block. For weeks, possibly months, he had been spying on neighbors through their cameras, watching their routines, their children, their lives. Melanie's heart broke the moment she saw the truth unfold in front of her. The person she had trusted, protected, and welcomed into her home had violated everyone's privacy, and in the process she had wrongfully accused an innocent man who had done nothing but mind his own business. When the police placed Brandon in handcuffs, Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't lash out. He simply stood at a distance, arms folded, watching with quiet disappointment. When Melanie tried to apologize, her voice trembling with shame, he only said 5 words, "Just do better next time." And then he turned and walked inside. That sentence haunted her. It wasn't angry or cruel. It wasn't even cold. It was honest, and that made it hurt more than any accusation ever could. Marcus had every right to be furious. Instead, he chose dignity. Inside her home, the silence was deafening. Brandon's room was still untouched, but Melanie couldn't bring herself to enter. Her trust had been shattered, not just in her nephew, but in herself. She had let fear win. She had let assumptions guide her, and in doing so nearly ruined an innocent man's peace. Days passed, but the guilt didn't. She wrote Marcus a letter long, honest, and handwritten. She explained how sorry she was, not only for the phone call, but for not seeing what was really happening right in front of her. She left the letter on his porch, unsure if he'd ever read it. He never responded, and she didn't blame him. What she didn't know was that Marcus had read the letter. He didn't write back, not because he didn't forgive her, but because he knew some things weren't meant to be fixed with words. They were meant to be remembered. Melanie knew she couldn't change the past, but she could change herself. She joined the Neighborhood Watch not to patrol others, but to educate herself and others about digital privacy and unconscious bias. She began speaking out at local community events, sharing her story as a cautionary tale. "I thought I was protecting my neighborhood shed, say, but I ended up accusing someone who was actually trying to protect all of us." In a place like Maple Ridge, where people preferred to keep to themselves, Melanie Foster's mistake became a lesson. A reminder that sometimes the greatest threat isn't a stranger in the shadows, but the fear we refuse to confront in ourselves. And that day, a woman who once acted out of suspicion started learning how to live with humility, accountability, and a new understanding of what it really means to be a good neighbor. In the days following Brandon Foster's arrest, the once peaceful neighborhood of Maple Ridge felt different. Parents double-checked their home security settings. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other were suddenly trading advice on digital privacy. A quiet shift was happening, one rooted not in fear, but in awareness. Marcus Allen, the man who had been wrongly accused, returned to his routine with quiet resilience. He didn't seek applause or recognition. He simply made sure his story sparked the right kind of conversations. And it did. At a local community center, concerned residents gathered not to point fingers, but to learn. A cybersecurity specialist offered advice on securing Wi-Fi networks. A pastor spoke on the dangers of judging others too quickly. And in a quiet corner, Melanie Foster really listened for the first time in a long while. She'd made a mistake. A big one, but she was determined to grow from it. So were many others. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a hacker. It was about how easily we can misjudge, how quickly fear can blind us to the truth, and how important it is to stay informed, connected, and humble. Trust isn't built on assumptions, it's earned through understanding. Sometimes the real threat isn't what we see, but what we assume we're seeing. Before rushing to judgment, pause. Listen. Ask. Because one wrong assumption can ruin trust, but one thoughtful action can build a safer, stronger community. If this story made you think twice, don't scroll away. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts, or a time you learned not to judge too quickly. Like this story if you believe in second chances. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that open eyes and inspire hearts. Your support helps these important messages reach more people. Let's grow together.